The space station floated quietly near the edge of the forgotten belt. No name, no flag, no beacon. It was old, rusting, and broken in many places. The power flickered on and off. Most systems were offline. The only sounds were the quiet hum of dying machines and the occasional hiss of leaking gas. It was a place no one visited anymore. No trade, no life, no reason to be there. But someone still lived inside. Hidden in one of the cold maintenance rooms, behind pipes and wires, sat a young alien girl. Her skin was pale, almost silver, with glowing lines on her arms that pulsed weakly like a dying heartbeat. She had no name, at least not one she remembered. She had stopped using it long ago. The scientists who made her called her Subject Z55. Others called her Scrap or Failure. She was small, quiet, and moved like a shadow. Her body had scars, not from battle, but from tests, endless, painful tests. They told her she had no value. Her design was wrong. Her thoughts were slow. Her reactions were weak. In the end, they left her here, alone, to fade away. And she believed them. For many cycles, she stayed hidden, surviving on leftover nutrient paste and cold recycled water. She listened to the silence. It became her only friend. When the lights flickered, she didn't move. When the air grew thin, she simply breathed slower. She had accepted her fate. To vanish without being remembered, to die in a place no one would ever find. But then, the human came. His ship, small and old like the station, docked with a sharp screech of metal. He was just passing through, looking for salvage, maybe fuel, maybe parts. His name was Eli Ward. He wore a worn jacket with patches from planets long forgotten, and he whistled as he worked, even when he was alone. His boots echoed in the halls as he moved room by room, checking wires, storage crates, and old systems. He wasn't afraid. He'd seen worse. Z55 watched him from the shadows. She didn't understand him. Why would someone come here? There was nothing to find. She waited for him to leave, but he didn't. In fact, he stayed longer than anyone ever had. He worked calmly, talking to himself like humans often do. "Looks like this place hasn't seen love in years," he said while pulling out burnt cables. "But you still got some juice left, huh?" he added, patting a flickering control panel. She thought about showing herself, just for a moment. Maybe he would leave faster if he saw her. Or maybe he would destroy her. That would be okay too. It wouldn't hurt more than the years already had. But he found her first. It happened when he opened a broken supply hatch. The metal creaked loudly, and behind it, curled up in the dark, was the girl. Her eyes, glowing faint blue, met his. He didn't move, didn't draw a weapon, didn't scream. He just looked at her. Then he crouched slowly, lowering his body to her level. "Hey there," he said, voice soft, almost like a whisper. "Didn't think anyone was still here." She stared, confused. No one had ever spoken to her like that. Not with kindness, not with care. He held up his hands. "It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you." She didn't believe him, of course. Why would she? She backed away into the corner, body tense, waiting for pain. But it never came. He sat down on the floor, cross-legged, like he wasn't in a rush, like he wasn't scared. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated. She hadn't spoken in years. Her voice was weak, her throat dry. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. "That's all right," Eli said, smiling gently. "You don't have to say anything." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a protein bar. Slowly, carefully, he placed it on the floor between them. "I'll leave this here for you. You look like you could use it." Then, just like that, he stood up and walked away. She didn't move for a long time. Then, once the silence returned, she crawled forward and picked up the bar. It was warm from his hand. She sniffed it, nibbled, and ate it all. For the first time in years, her stomach felt full. He came back the next day, and the next. each time with a small gift, a blanket, clean water, soft fruit, even a calm. He talked to her, even when she didn't respond. "You remind me of my little sister," he said once. She was quiet too, but kind. Another day, he fixed a broken heater and pointed it toward her corner. "No one should freeze to death," he said. "Not on my watch." Bit by bit, she started to trust him. Not fully, but enough to come out when he arrived. Enough to sit near him. Enough to listen. Finally, one day, she spoke. "Zura," she said, voice barely above a whisper. Eli looked up, surprised. "Zura? That's your name?" She nodded slowly. "Well, Zura," he smiled. "That's a beautiful name." She blinked, unsure what to say. No one had ever called her beautiful. Eli stood up and reached out a hand. "Come with me. Let's get out of this place." Zura hesitated. Her mind screamed no. She had never been outside this station. She didn't know what waited beyond. But his hand was warm. And for the first time, she felt something strange. Hope. She took his hand. They walked together through the old halls, the lights flickering above them like stars. Zura looked back once, at the only place she had ever known. Then she looked forward, toward the ship waiting to take her away. She didn't know what waited on the other side, but something inside her told her that this man, this strange human, saw something in her that no one else had. Value. And what she didn't know, what no one knew, was that hidden deep inside her, beyond flesh and bone, was something the galaxy had forgotten. Something powerful. Something dangerous. Something worth killing for. As the airlock closed behind them, and the ship engines began to hum, far away in the blackness of space, a signal activated. A signal that said, Z-55 has left containment. And the hunt had begun. Zura sat silently on the cold metal floor of the small ship as it drifted away from the dying space station. Her eyes, still faintly glowing, stayed fixed on the tiny window beside her. The stars outside seemed so much brighter now, like they were alive, moving slowly in the Black Sea. For most of her life, they were only specks she watched from a dark corner, unreachable dreams. Now she was moving among them. She didn't know what to feel. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the seat. The hum of the ship, the gentle rattle of loose bolts, the soft footsteps of Eli moving in the next room. Everything was new. Strange. Quiet in a different way than the station. And warmer. Not in temperature, but in feeling. Eli's voice called from the cockpit. "Hey Zura, come up front. You should see this." She hesitated. Her bare feet touched the smooth floor carefully as she rose. Every step was slow. She passed by walls with hanging wires, a cracked monitor, a soft blue light that flickered. The ship was old, patched together from different models, and yet it felt like it had life. Eli sat in the pilot's chair, one leg kicked up, hands casually resting on controls. The main window showed a wide spread of stars, planets in the distance, and a nebula glowing purple and green like painted smoke. "Pretty, right?" he said, turning to her. She nodded slightly, her eyes wide. "This is the Chiral Belt," he explained. "A lot of miners avoid it now. Radiation storms, magnetic waves, but I've learned to fly through it just fine." Zura didn't answer, but she listened carefully. "You okay?" Eli asked. She looked at him and finally whispered, "I don't know." Eli chuckled softly. "That's fair." He turned back to the controls, guiding the ship through a narrow pass. After a while, he stood up and gestured toward the small table behind them. "Come on, you need food." They sat across from each other. Eli opened a small container, hot noodles, some kind of alien vegetable, and a drink pouch. Zura stared at the food but didn't move. Eli noticed. "You don't have to be scared. This is real food. No more paste." She blinked. Her hand slowly reached forward. The warmth of the bowl touched her fingers. She took one bite, and her eyes widened. It was soft, full of flavor, like nothing she had ever tasted. A low sound escaped her lips, like a surprised breath. Eli smiled. "That good, huh?" She looked down and nodded. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was peaceful. Later, Eli showed her the small bunk area. It was cramped, barely big enough for two, but clean. He gave her the lower bunk. "You rest. I'll take the top." She lay down carefully, pulling the soft blanket over herself. Her body was used to metal floors and cold air. This was strange, but nice. She closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come quickly. Her mind replayed everything. The station, the pain, the silence, and now this man, Eli, offering her food, warmth, and safety, for nothing in return. Why? She didn't understand. Back in the cockpit, Eli stared at the screen, scanning the systems. The ship was running fine. Fuel was low, but enough to reach the nearest trade moon. His fingers tapped on a small communicator. He thought about sending a message to his old contacts to let them know he found something. But he paused. He looked toward the back, where Zura now slept. She wasn't something. She was someone. He leaned back and sighed. "What have you gotten yourself into, Ward?" Morning cycles on the ship were gentle. The lights brightened slowly, and Eli played soft earth music from a dusty speaker. Zura woke to the sound of strings, violins, and something called a piano. She had never heard music before. It filled her chest with something. Not sadness, not joy. Something in between. She found Eli fixing a loose panel in the kitchen. "Good morning," he said. Zura nodded. "What is that sound?" He looked surprised. "You mean the music?" She nodded again. He smiled. "That's Beethoven. Human composer. Lived a long time ago. He made music even after he went deaf. Couldn't hear it, just felt it." Zura tilted her head. "Why would he do that?" "Because sometimes," Eli said, "we need to make something beautiful, even when the world can't hear us." Zura looked at the speaker again. The music played on. Later, as Eli was running a diagnostic on the ship's core, Zura wandered into the medbay. It was small, only a single scanner and some basic tools, but something about it drew her in. She sat on the exam chair and looked at her reflection in the mirror. She touched the glowing lines on her arms. They pulsed slowly. She had always hated them. Marks of failure, reminders of what she wasn't. But today, for the first time, she wondered what they meant. She pressed a button. The scanner whirred to life. Blue light moved over her skin. Data appeared on the screen. Strange characters, symbols from the Varnak language. Eli walked in behind her and froze. "What is all this?" he asked. Zura didn't answer. She stared at the screen. Eli stepped forward. "I've seen Varnak tech before. But this isn't normal." He typed quickly, translating what he could. "Neural lock, hidden pathways, energy cores." His eyes widened. "You're not just enhanced. You're a living key." Zura frowned. "Key?" Eli nodded. "I don't know how, but you're holding data. Real data, probably stolen from the Varnak." She pulled her hands back, panic rising in her chest. They'll come for me." Eli looked at her. "Do you want to go back?" "No," she whispered. "Never." "Then they won't get you," he said firmly. She looked up. "Even if they hurt you." He smiled. "Let them try." In that moment, something changed between them. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She wasn't cargo. She was someone worth protecting. And Eli, he wasn't just a rescuer. He was her shield. But neither of them knew. Far across the galaxy, a red signal blinked in a dark Varnak command ship. A captain read the message. "Subject Z-55 has left Station 9. Active." He narrowed his eyes. "Send the hunters." The hunt had truly begun. And Zura's journey was only just starting. The stars outside shimmered like scattered diamonds, but inside the ship, everything felt heavy. Zura sat quietly on the floor near the ship's engine room, her legs crossed, her glowing arms resting on her knees. The soft hum of the ship used to bring comfort, but now it only reminded her of what Eli had discovered. She was not just an abandoned girl, not just a failed creation. Inside her, buried deep, was something she didn't understand. A code, a system, maybe a weapon. Something the Varnak wanted back. She didn't ask for this. She didn't want it. But now she had it. Eli paced slowly in the cockpit, his eyes locked on a small tablet in his hands. He had spent the last few hours going through the scanner logs, trying to make sense of the data. Everything he found only brought more questions. Some of the codes were locked, sealed under layers of Varnak encryption. But what he could read shocked him. She was built with layers of artificial and organic memory. The data inside her was live, growing, changing. It wasn't just information. It was thinking. She's evolving, he whispered to himself. She's not just carrying something. She is something. He turned and glanced down the hallway, where Zura sat in silence. She hadn't moved for hours. Her eyes were open, staring straight ahead, but her mind was far away. Memories from the station came back like waves. Memories of metal tables, cold tools, voices speaking in numbers, needles digging into her skin, and the whisper of the word, defective. She never cried. The scientists had said crying was a weakness, and they punished her for it. But now, away from them, on this ship, she wanted to cry. Not from fear, from confusion. From the strange warmth she felt whenever Eli spoke to her like she mattered. She touched her chest gently. Something stirred there. Something strange. Alive. Zura. Eli's voice came from behind her. She looked up, startled. You all right? He asked, walking slowly toward her. She nodded, but her eyes were heavy. He sat beside her, not too close, just near enough that she didn't feel alone. You've been quiet. I'm thinking, she said. About what? She took a long breath. Why did they make me, if they didn't want me? Eli blinked. The question hit him like a punch in the chest. I don't know, he said softly. Sometimes people create things they don't understand, and when they're afraid of what they've made, they destroy it. Zura looked at him. Are you afraid of me? Eli thought for a moment. Then he shook his head. No, I've seen fear. You're not fear. You're possibility. She didn't know what that meant, but it sounded like something good. Later, as Eli continued his scans, he noticed a blinking light on the outer panel. He muttered, walking over. He tapped the screen. A transmission alert popped up, encrypted, bouncing from multiple satellites. His face hardened. Someone pinged our ship's signature. He checked the coordinates. The signal had come from a nearby moon outpost, a trade station known for information smugglers and bounty drops. Someone knew they were there. Someone was looking. Eli turned off the ship's transponder and dimmed the lights. Zura walked in, noticing the sudden change in mood. What happened? Someone just found us, he said. We need to leave. Fast. He rushed to the cockpit, pulling the controls, activating thrusters. But before he could launch, a loud ping echoed through the ship. A second signal. Stronger. This time, it came with a message. Eli opened it. A simple sentence appeared on the screen. Subject Z55. Alive. Reward 900,000 credits. His stomach sank. Zura stood behind him, reading it too. Her breath caught in her throat. They want me back, she whispered. Eli's jaw tightened. They're not getting you. But that's so much money, she said. More than any ship, more than any cargo. I'm not selling you, Zura, he said firmly. But I'm not worth that, she replied, voice shaking. I'm not worth anything. You don't get to say that, Eli said. Not anymore. Not after what you've survived. Not after what I've seen. Zura looked away. Suddenly, the ship shook. A loud clang echoed from the hull. The lights flickered. "They're here," Eli muttered. He grabbed his blaster and tossed Zura a small tool. "Hide in the back. Lock the door. Don't come out until I say." She wanted to argue, but fear held her still. She nodded and ran down the hallway. Eli moved toward the loading ramp. The sensors showed a small boarding pod had attached to their side. 2 life forms. Armed. The ramp hissed open, and 2 figures stepped inside. Tall, wearing black armor with red visors. Varnak bounty hunters. Silent, fast, deadly. "Stand down," one of them said in a deep, cold voice. Eli raised his blaster. "She's not here." The hunter tilted his head. "We know she is. She's transmitting. Even now." Eli blinked. "What?" The hunter pointed at a device. "She's been tagged. She doesn't know it." Eli's heart dropped. Of course. The Varnak must have embedded a locator inside her years ago. He fired without thinking. The ship roared with the sound of weapons. Sparks flew. Pipes hissed. The floor trembled. Zura, locked in the back room, heard it all. Her hands shook. She looked around the room. No weapons, no armor, no tools. Just herself. And then, something inside her clicked. Her arms began to glow brighter. Her fingers twitched, not from fear, but from power. A warm, electric feeling spread through her chest. Her vision blurred, then sharpened. She felt every wire in the ship, every bolt, every system. She felt the ship itself. The door unlocked. She didn't touch it. It just opened. Zura stepped out. Down the hallway, Eli was cornered. His blaster was kicked away. The hunter raised the glowing knife. Before it could strike, the lights exploded in a burst of energy. The hunters turned. Too late. Zura stood at the end of the corridor, her eyes glowing pure white, her arms lit with flowing energy. She raised a hand. The metal under the hunter's feet bent upward like soft clay, throwing them off balance. She stepped forward, and the walls pulsed with her. The ship responded to her. The hunters scrambled, trying to shoot, but their weapons jammed. Eli watched in disbelief as Zura's voice echoed through the ship's speakers. "Leave. Now." The hunters backed away, confused, stumbling toward their pod. Zura flicked her hand, and their pod detached, flying into space without control. The room went still. Her glow faded. She fell to her knees, breathing hard, shaking. Eli rushed forward, catching her before she hit the floor. "Zura, what did you just do?" She looked up at him, weak but alive. "I don't know," she whispered. But deep inside her, something had awakened. And it was only the beginning. The silence after the battle was strange. Not peaceful, just quiet in a heavy way, like the ship itself was holding its breath. Eli carried Zura gently back to the bunk room. She had passed out after using her strange power. Her skin had gone pale, and her glowing arms dimmed to a faint blue. He laid her down carefully, covering her with a blanket, brushing a few strands of silver hair from her face. He stared at her for a long time. Zura wasn't just a girl anymore. She wasn't just a lost creation or a victim. She was powerful, maybe too powerful. She had taken control of the entire ship with a thought. She bent metal without touching it. She scared off 2 trained Varnak hunters without lifting a weapon. And yet, when he looked at her now, she didn't seem dangerous. Just tired. Just human. Well, something like human. Eli sat beside her for a while, listening to her soft breathing. Then he stood up and walked to the cockpit. He needed answers. Real ones. No more guessing. He pulled up the scanner logs again, this time searching deeper, beyond the surface data, beyond what the Varnak wanted people to see. He used every trick he knew from years of salvaging, every codebreaker, every bypass he had ever built. Finally, A locked file blinked open. The screen filled with Varnak text, harsh and sharp like blades. Eli ran it through his translator slowly, line by line. Project. Vessel Series. Z-55. Status. Alpha Protoclass. Core Purpose. Memory storage / adaptive evolution / energy absorption. Notes. Unstable emotional core. Shows signs of self-awareness. Early results suggest strong connection to artificial intelligence systems and mechanical environments. Considered too dangerous. Terminated from further development. Eli leaned back, stunned. Zura wasn't just a failed experiment. She was a prototype, one of the first, a test version of something much greater. The Varnak hadn't discarded her because she was weak. They discarded her because they were afraid of what she might become. She had the power to connect with machines, to control them. And not just simple systems. She had stopped the ship's weapons. She had crushed metal. If she learned to grow those powers, she could control entire fleets. Or destroy them. His hand tightened on the edge of the console. He looked back down the hallway toward where she slept. Outside the ship, space remained calm. But far across the stars, things were changing. In a dark corner of the galaxy, aboard a massive Varnak command vessel, alarms flashed red. A dozen officers stood around a glowing table, watching lines of code scroll across a screen. The message was clear. Z-55 is active. A tall figure stepped forward. His armor was gold-trimmed, his face hidden by a mask of steel. His voice was deep, cold, without emotion. "Where is she now?" A younger officer responded nervously. "Last location. Sector Chiral Belt. Human vessel. Signature ID. The Wren." The masked figure tilted his head. Eli Ward. He knew that name. A known smuggler. Former engineer. Dangerous only in his unpredictability. "Send a signal to the Shadow Hunters," he ordered. "Tell them the asset must be recovered. Alive if possible, but dead if necessary." He turned to the screen again, watching Zura's image, taken years ago when she was still strapped to a cold metal table, wires in her skin, eyes empty. She was no longer empty. And that meant trouble. Back aboard the Wren, Zura finally woke. Her head pounded softly. Her vision was slow to return. But she wasn't in pain. Not like before. This was different. She felt heavy, like part of her had burned out, and was still cooling down. Eli was there when she opened her eyes. "Hey," he said softly, "you scared me." Zura sat up slowly. "What happened?" "You saved us," he replied. Again. She blinked. "I didn't mean to. I just reacted." Eli nodded. "Your body did more than react, Zura. You bent the ship. You locked their weapons. You used systems you didn't even know existed." She looked away. "I don't know how I did it." "I do," he said, holding up the tablet. "I read the logs. I found your file." Zura didn't speak. "You're not a mistake," he continued. "You're a prototype. They didn't throw you away because you were broken. They threw you away because they couldn't control you." Zura's hands curled into fists. "They lied to me," she whispered. "Yes," Eli said. "They did." She looked at him. "What do I do now?" Eli stood up. "We need to get that tracker out of you. Whatever signal they planted, it's calling them straight to us." He brought her to the med bay again. The room was small and quiet. He turned on the scanner and asked her to lie down. She obeyed, her eyes wide but calm. He scanned her body again, looking for anything unnatural. Finally, near the base of her neck, hidden between nerves, was a small metal dot. "There it is," he said. "Deep, but removable. Will it hurt?" "A little." She nodded. "Do it." Eli cleaned his tools and worked carefully. It took time. The metal was fused to her nerves, and one wrong move could cause damage. But Eli had steady hands. He'd repaired ship cores in asteroid storms. He could handle this. Finally, with one soft twist, he pulled the device free. It was no bigger than a grain of sand, but it had called death to her doorstep. Eli dropped it into a small lead box and sealed it. "No more signals," he said. Zura sat up slowly, rubbing her neck. She felt free. She stood, walked toward the small window again, and stared into the stars. Eli leaned against the wall. "There's a spaceport not far from here. Old place, but friendly to humans. We'll hide out there for a while. Rest, get supplies, then figure out next steps." Zura turned to him. "You're still helping me." He frowned. "Of course. But you've seen what I am. I'm not human. I'm not safe." Eli shook his head. "You're more than they made you to be. I don't care what the Varnek call you. I've seen your heart, Zura, and you've got more of it than most people I've ever met." Her eyes softened. "Thank you," she whispered. Eli smiled. The ship turned toward the spaceport, but they didn't know that the Varnek fleet had already changed direction. A hunter ship had picked up the last fragment of the tracker signal, enough to estimate their heading, and it was moving fast. Zura looked out the window one last time before lying down. For the first time since her creation, she wasn't waiting to die. She was preparing to live. And whatever waited ahead, she was done running. But the galaxy wasn't done with her. Not yet. The spaceport came into view slowly, rising like a sleeping beast from the dark side of a barren moon. It wasn't beautiful. The walls were rusted, the landing pads uneven, and the tower lights blinked with weak power. But it was quiet. Tucked between asteroid fields and ignored trade routes, the port had one special gift: secrecy. Eli guided the Wren toward one of the open hangars. The landing gears creaked as they touched down. Dust swirled in the air. Outside, only a few figures moved, mostly traders, miners, and workers. No uniforms, no questions, just people surviving. Inside the ship, Zura stood by the exit ramp, clutching the edge of her shirt with nervous fingers. She wore a clean jacket Eli had given her. It was too big and hung past her waist, but she liked it. It smelled like metal and oil, and somehow that made her feel safe. Eli checked his blaster and turned to her. "You ready?" Zura didn't answer right away. Her eyes scanned the small screen near the door. No signs of pursuit, no red alerts, just normal, boring station data. "I think so," she whispered. "Stay close," Eli said. "Keep your hood up." She nodded and pulled the fabric over her silver hair. The glow in her arms had faded since the fight, but small lines still shimmered faintly. She couldn't turn it off, not completely. They stepped into the dusty air of the port. The smell hit Zura first: old oil, cooked meat, smoke, and something sharp she couldn't name. It was overwhelming, but exciting too. She had never walked freely among others before. She stayed close to Eli, her steps light and careful. The market area buzzed with soft sounds, voices speaking in different languages, machines beeping, crates being moved. Everyone was too busy to care who they were. No one stopped to stare. For the first time, Zura felt invisible in a good way. Eli led her into a small repair shop owned by a grumpy four-eyed mechanic named Marn. The man growled when he saw Eli, then laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. "I thought you were dead," Marn said. "Not yet," Eli replied. "Need fuel, supplies, and a new ID signal." Marn glanced at Zura, who stood behind Eli like a shadow. "That your kid?" Eli hesitated. "Something like that." Marn snorted. "You always find trouble." Eli grinned. "Wouldn't be me if I didn't." They made a deal, traded parts for favors, and soon Zura and Eli were sitting in a quiet booth at a corner food stall. The table was sticky, and the light above flickered, but the food was warm. Zura held a cup of soup in her hands. She didn't drink yet. She just stared into it. "What are you thinking?" Eli asked. She looked up. "They're still coming, aren't they?" Eli nodded. Yes, but we've got time. Not much, but enough to plan. Zura was silent for a while. Then she said, I don't want to run forever. Eli leaned forward. You won't. She met his eyes. Then I need to know what I am. I need to understand this. She lifted her hand, and for just a moment, a flicker of blue light danced across her fingers. Eli looked around and lowered her hand gently. Not here. She nodded. That night, back on the ship, Zura sat alone in the engine room. She closed her eyes and reached inward, searching for the spark she had felt before. The strange warmth, the quiet hum that wasn't coming from the ship, but from her. She remembered the moment the hunters attacked, the fear in Ila's eyes, the sound of metal bending. She hadn't just done something. She had connected to something bigger. She touched the floor. Her fingers traced the wires beneath the panel. A soft vibration tickled her skin. The ship spoke to her, not in words, but in feeling. It welcomed her. Zura focused. The lights above her flickered once, then grew steady. Panels along the wall shifted. Fans slowed. Systems began to hum in a rhythm that matched her breathing. She wasn't just controlling them. She was becoming part of them. The door opened quietly behind her. Eli stepped in and stopped. He watched as the entire engine room glowed gently with a pale blue light, following Zura's presence like flowers turning to sunlight. Zura opened her eyes slowly. Her voice was calm. I think I was designed to be a bridge. Eli frowned. A bridge. Between thought and machine, she said. Between energy and feeling. I can talk to systems. I can hear them. Eli stepped closer. Can you control more than this ship? She nodded. Yes, but it's not control. It's understanding. Like listening to music. Every ship, every machine, has a song. Eli sat beside her. What about weapons? Could you stop a fleet? Zura hesitated. I don't know. Maybe, but something tells me I was made to do more than that. What then? She looked at him, eyes glowing faintly. Change them. Change the ones who made me. Show them I'm not a tool. Eli smiled. That sounds like something worth fighting for. Suddenly, the alarm rang out, soft but clear. Eli rushed to the cockpit. One ship, fast, no ID signature, too quiet. Zura joined him. Her eyes narrowed. It's a hunter. Eli cursed. They tracked us faster than I thought. The ship's scanners beeped again. Another signal, then another. 3 more hunter ships dropped from hyperspace like shadows. Zura took a step forward. She reached out her hand, touched the controls. The ship responded immediately. Weapons primed. Shields activated. Eli blinked. You're syncing with the system already. Zura nodded. I can protect us. Eli grabbed his blaster. We'll protect each other. Outside, the stars flickered. Inside, Zura's power stirred. She was no longer the scared girl hiding in a dark station. She was something new. And the Varnak were about to learn that what they threw away was coming back stronger than they ever imagined. The cold blackness outside the ship was quiet, but the tension inside the Wren was sharp, heavy, like something just waiting to break. Zura stood at the front of the ship, staring out the window at the approaching hunter crafts. 4 of them now, moving in slow formation. No lights, no transmissions. They floated like vultures in the dark, silent and waiting. Eli stood behind her, checking weapons, adjusting shield output, watching the scanners. He had seen many battles before, but this was different. These weren't pirates or soldiers. These were Varnak hunters, built for one purpose: to retrieve what belonged to their empire or destroy it trying. And right now, they believed Zura belonged to them. Eli looked at her. They're not attacking yet. Zura nodded. They're watching, waiting to see if I run. Will you? She didn't answer for a moment. Then she slowly turned to face him. No, I'm done running. Her voice was calm. but there was something new in it. Strength. Purpose. Her eyes glowed softly, not from fear, but from control. Eli lowered his weapon slightly. "What are you thinking?" Zura stepped toward the console, gently resting her hand on the interface. "I want to speak to them." Eli blinked. "What?" "Zura, they're not here to talk. They're here to drag you back in chains, or worse." "I know," she said, "but I'm not a prisoner. Not anymore. If I want to stop this, I need to show them who I am now." Before Eli could respond, she touched the console. Her fingers barely grazed the surface, and yet the ship lit up in response. A soft blue wave pulsed through the panels. The communicator came alive. One of the hunter ships responded. A face appeared on the screen. Cold, emotionless. Varnak. His skin was dark bronze, his eyes like empty glass. No warmth, no pity. "Subject Z-55, he said flatly. "You will surrender now." Zura looked at him without blinking. "I am not your subject. You were designed by us. You carry classified data. You are property of the Varnak." "No," she said. "You created me, but you never valued me. You left me to die. I made my own path. I'm free." The Varnak didn't flinch. "Your feelings are irrelevant. The mission will be completed." Zura's eyes narrowed. "Then come and face what you built." The screen went dark. Eli stared at her. "You just challenged the most ruthless hunters in the galaxy." "I know," she said quietly, "but I can't hide from what I am anymore." Outside, the hunter ships began to move. Zura didn't wait. She reached deeper into the ship's systems. Her hands glowed brighter now. The panels responded faster. The ship itself seemed to breathe with her, every engine, every sensor, every wire obeying without delay. Eli took the co-pilot's seat, readying the weapons. The first blast came fast, a bolt of red plasma from the lead hunter. The Wren jerked hard, shields flashing. Zura reacted instantly. Instead of firing back, she pushed the ship into a sharp spin, weaving between asteroid debris with unnatural grace. She wasn't just flying the ship, she was the ship. Eli held on. "Zura, you're moving like we're inside a fighter, not a freighter." "I can feel the timing," she said. "Every second, every rotation. It's all music now." A second blast flew by, missing by inches, then a third, which she absorbed with a sudden redirection of the shield grid. Eli fired a return shot, damaging one hunter's wing. It spun off, trailing smoke. The other three closed in tighter. Zura's glow increased. Lights danced across her arms and face. Her breath grew deeper. Her mind opened further. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was becoming what they feared. As the ships surrounded them, she sent out a pulse, a wave of raw energy that rippled through space like a storm. The hunter ships shook. Inside their cockpits, systems blinked red. Guidance faltered. Targeting froze. Zura spoke again, this time through the ship's external audio. "You abandoned me in the dark. Now you will hear me in the light." She pulsed again, this time deeper, into their communication links. She reached past their weapons, into their thoughts. Not control, just presence. "I know your machines. I know your codes. You left your song inside me." One of the ships lost all power and drifted away. Another tried to fire, but its weapons refused. Only one remained, circling, confused, trying to break her grip. Inside the Wren, Zura's legs began to shake. Her power was growing, but so was the cost. Her body was overheating. Her heart beat faster. She could feel her veins burning. Eli saw her stumble. "Zura, you're pushing too far." She shook her head. "I can stop this. I can stop them. But you'll kill yourself." She looked at him, her face glowing like starlight. "I was made to die for them. I want to live for me." And with that, she sent one final surge. Not of force, but of truth. A memory. She broadcast it into the minds of the hunters. A clear, burning vision. Zura as a child, alone, strapped to a table, crying out. The voices of Varnak scientists calling her garbage, failure, trash. And then, her voice now. Strong. Whole. I am not your mistake. I am your mirror. The last hunter ship stopped. Frozen. Then slowly, it turned away. One by one, the ships disappeared into hyperspace. Gone. Zura collapsed. Eli caught her before she hit the floor. Her skin was hot, glowing still, her breathing shallow. He carried her back to the mid-bay, heart pounding. She had won. But the cost wasn't clear yet. He laid her down gently. Her eyes fluttered open for just a second. Did they go? She asked. Eli nodded. Yes. You made them listen. She smiled faintly. Good. Then she closed her eyes. The ship dimmed with her, as if mourning gently. But Eli didn't cry. Not yet. He stayed by her side, holding her hand. He didn't know what would happen next. But he knew this. She wasn't a tool. She wasn't a weapon. She was the future. And she had chosen to live. The lights on the Wren stayed low for many hours. Outside the ship, the vast moon drifted slowly in orbit, silent and untouched. Inside, nothing moved except for the gentle rise and fall of Zura's chest. She lay on the medical table, still and pale, her hands resting quietly by her sides. The glow that had once wrapped around her like living light had faded to a soft shimmer, barely there, like starlight about to vanish. But she was alive, and that was all Eli cared about. He sat by her side, elbows on his knees, hands hanging limp. He hadn't moved in hours. The bags under his eyes were dark, and his lips stayed pressed in a hard line. But his gaze never left her face. He thought about everything that had happened. The day he found her on that forgotten station. The first time she spoke. The first time she smiled. The moment she stood between him and death. And now, this. She had driven away the Varnak hunters. Not with weapons, but with truth. With memory. With something they could not destroy. She had made them feel. And that had shaken them more than any laser blast could. Zura stirred. Her fingers twitched. Eli leaned forward quickly. Zura. Her eyes opened slowly. Tired. Glowing just faintly. She looked around, then at him. You didn't leave, she whispered. He smiled. You saved us. Did you really think I'd walk away after that? She blinked slowly. I thought, maybe you'd be afraid. I'm afraid for you, he said. Not of you. She sat up slowly, every movement stiff, like her body had run 1,000 miles. Her skin was warm, but the pain had faded. What remained was something new. A calmness. A quiet power. I thought I would die, she said. But you didn't, Eli replied. She nodded, then looked at her hands. What I did, it wasn't just power. I reached inside them. I let them see me. I made them feel. You gave them something they never expected, he said. A voice. She looked at him. Do you think they'll come back? Eli leaned back in the chair. Maybe. Maybe not. But I don't think they'll forget you. Zura stood up slowly. She walked toward the small window and stared at the stars. They no longer looked distant, no longer unreachable. They felt open, like something waiting. What now? She asked softly. Eli joined her at the window. Now, we breathe. We heal. We decide what you want. She was quiet for a long moment. I want to find others like me, she said at last. Others the Varnak discarded. If I was one experiment, maybe there were more. Eli nodded. That's a big journey. She looked at him. You don't have to come. He laughed. Zura, I'm the one who found you in a garbage station, remember? I'm in this. Besides, someone has to keep this old ship running. She smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. Outside, the galaxy waited. The Wren lifted off from the moon, its engines humming gently. The sky opened before them, and the stars stretched like threads of light. Zura stood at the front, her hand resting lightly on the console. She no longer needed to force her power. The ship responded to her like a friend, like a part of her. As they passed into hyperspace, she closed her eyes. She remembered the station, the fear, the cold, the loneliness. She remembered Eli's voice, his warmth, his choice to stay. And she remembered the Varnek, how they had called her worthless, how they had abandoned her. But now, she had made her own choice. She was not a mistake. She was not their tool. She was Zura, a bridge between thought and machine, a voice for the voiceless, and a light for the broken. Somewhere, far behind them, in the deep halls of the Varnek Empire, the name Z55 was no longer spoken with shame. It was spoken with silence, with fear, with respect. She had changed something, and she was just getting started. As the Wren vanished into the blue trail of hyperspace, the stars blinked once more, and the galaxy began to listen.